We are thrilled to have with us Beth Huebner, who is a professor in the Department of Criminology and Criminal Justice at the University of Missouri St. Louis. She is going to talk about, go back to 2014 and Ferguson and what, some of the things that caused that and some of the reforms that were they attempt to institute after that and what became of those. She's currently serving as principal investigator for the St. Louis County MacArthur Safety and Justice Challenge, which is tasked with reducing the jail population in St. Louis County through systems reform. She is a current vice president of American Society of Criminology, and I want to thank her for being patient. We allowed that last session to go a little bit longer, and we're going to have to eat some time out of her session. So I want to thank her flexibility on that, but we want to get questions and we want to get as many speakers as we can. So it's 4:15 right now. We'll take this session until 5:05, and then we'll have to draw it all to a close. But I want to thank Beth and turn it over.
Yeah, well, thank you. It was nice to follow Thomas. He does excellent work. He was talking about violent crime. We're going to shift all the way to the end of the spectrum, other end, and talk about misdemeanor justice here today. And so when I was asked to speak, the theme was about George Floyd, and I thought maybe I could share some of the work that we have done in post-Ferguson. Thank you to the Arnold Foundation for funding most of this work, and this work comes in partnership with a lot of colleagues. Let's see. Okay, well, as many of you know, misdemeanor arrests, or maybe you don't know, are the most prevalent form of social control. We think about violent crime a lot, which is important, but more people come under the misdemeanor justice system than anyone else. And like it says up here, about 13 million cases per year. But many people think that these are too low stakes to consider. Many of us get a traffic ticket, we pay it, we go home, we never think about it again. But that's not the case for everyone. And this issue came to light in 2014 after the killing of Michael Brown by a police officer. And the Department of Justice found that there was a generation of revenue through law enforcement. There was, quotas. The more tickets you got, the more money you got for your organization. And we know that there's a racialized application of fines and fees. So when we talk about racial equity, this is an important element to look at. But I was surprised. The legislature moved so quickly after the killing of Michael Brown and passed Max Creek's Law, what is also known as SB 5. And so this put a cap, 20% on budgets. It also capped fines on traffic violations. It barred some jail time, and then it offered community service as an alternative to financial payment. So today I'm going to talk about, did this work? What are some of the outcomes that we see in post-Ferguson? But I want to highlight here, and I'll go through some statistics really quickly. What we see in Ferguson is not exceptional. I have colleagues that have studied this topic in many of your states, and I'll put some of those statistics on here, but we see this in every state. So what we know is, neoliberal ideals have come through every single institution in the United States, schools, many things like that. And user fees are just a regular part of our daily life, right? We all pay user fees. Again, we just pay them, we grumble, but we move on. But we've, started shifting the funding of the criminal justice system to the people who are involved. And that's what I'm going to talk about today, is a lot of these legal and financial obligations. And as my colleague Alexis Harris says, these reinforce poverty, destabilize community, and relegate impoverished debtors to a lifetime of punishment. I'm going to talk about how people are tethered to the system because of these economic sanctions. And again, most of these sanctions, at least in Missouri, are given out by the municipal government, small community organizations. And we know that these small organizations not only tether people through fines and fees, but also through this procedural hassle. It takes a lot of time to pay these. People don't have money to go to the court, things like that, which I'll talk about a little bit more. So just to talk about the racialized history of the criminal justice system in St. Louis County, we do have 88 municipalities. I'll show you a map in just a second. 83 independent courts and 50 police agencies. You might be like, oh my gosh, this only happens in Missouri, but in fact it doesn't. It also happens in Pennsylvania, Texas, and many other states. So Missouri isn't unique in this as well. But we do address all the traffic and motor vehicle offenses in the criminal court, and that's not the case in every state. But we know, and I'm going to kind of give some of the ending point away here, that people of color are stopped at a disproportionate rate, and that's even in 2019. So we would want these numbers to be at 1 if there was parity between the two races, but it's really, again, black persons are 1.44 more likely to be contacted by the police. These are some of the lower numbers for some of the municipalities in the region. And we know, if you look at these data, they're mandated to be collected at the state level. They've not changed in 20 years. So we still have a lot of these challenges. Again, if you look at some of our other communities like St. Anne, they're even double that. Just in case you want to look at what this looks like, here's a quick map. As you can see, there's large racial segregation in St. Louis County and city as well, as is in many of the cities that I see represented here. Okay, well, what we know overall, not just in St. Louis, is that there has been a decline in enforcement. And we see that here. You can see kind of where the killing of Michael Brown happened right here, and we do see a decline. We absolutely see a substantial decline in some of this enforcement of these lower level offenses. But what we see is this has been happening for many years before this. So it's important to unpack if this was because of the laws or if this is just a larger trend. And again, we see this larger trend in many other cities as well. And we can talk about that in Q&A. But we know that warrants are also a really key part of this equation. And that's not something that I see people talk a lot about. It's usually just contact with the police. But what happens if you don't come to court and you get a warrant? This plays a critical element in St. Louis. And so as I have up here, in 2019, again, post all of these reforms, there were 150,000 warrants issued in 2019. Again, those can be after summons if you don't show up. Most of those are for issues like that. So we know that people are struggling to comply with a lot of these rules as well. And I'll give you some statistics about that also. And what we also know that is there's disproportionate enforcement of a lot of these rules in communities where there's higher proportions of people of color. So, and it's not just impoverished communities either. It really cuts across race lines. So if you look in Bellefontaine neighbors, it's in the north part of the region. It's 10,000 people live in this city. They had 3,795 warrants in 1 year, right? And so this is overwhelming to these communities. People come in contact with the police regularly, time and time and time again. Pasquis and Robinson call this pocketbook policing. So many communities want the same parks and schools and things like that other communities have, and so it's often by taking money from the residents there, and disproportionately, again, in these communities of color. We know that this takes a lot of time from police. In St. Louis City, about 20% of arrests are for this warrant enforcement, so people are spending a lot of time on this as well. And it's important to know in Missouri, if you have a warrant and you're pulled over by the police, they must take you to jail. It's a state law. So again, that brings people further into the criminal legal system by spending at least a couple hours in jail. Just to give you some statistics on what people are doing for these bench warrants, again, this is in St. Louis City. About half of these warrants are for failure to upkeep your vehicle. Either you don't have insurance, a license, we do have some public nuisance and panhandling, but these are not the violent crimes. You might be thinking, oh, there are warrants for stabbing or something like that. No, it's really these quality of life crimes. People can't pay for their car insurance. And as we know, as I mentioned, it's really critical to keep race on the top of our thoughts when we discuss these things. Because again, we see these decline in bench warrants. Absolutely, there was a very large dip after the killing of Michael Brown and the reforms, but we still see this 4-to-1 ratio in terms of black to white for warrants. And if you can see, it's going up and it continues to go back up. So people reflexively made some changes, but we do see it going back up. So we're continuing to map this as well. So I want to talk about some of the work that I have been doing lately. And so I'm just going to talk about a lot of broad things to kind of introduce you to some issues, and I can go into them further in questions and answers. But how has misdemeanor justice changed after we did these big, very quick, very public reforms in the state of Missouri? And I just wanted to give credit to all of the teams that I've been working with. And if you're in one of the states that did this research, the principal investigator is up here, and you should contact them to get some of this information. But we worked with a number of states, like I said, California, Georgia, Illinois, Minnesota, New York, Texas, and Washington. And we spoke to people. We did a legal review, we spoke to people, we spoke to stakeholders as well, and got official data. And if you're just wondering, what happens when I get pulled over, or what happens when I get a ticket? How much do I have to pay, really? Like, how much are these fines and fees? This is not the complete list I have from our legal review, but as you can see, there's a lot of fines and fees right here, right? Sheriff's fees, sheriff's retirement fund, brain injury fund. So when we're talking about funding the criminal justice system based on citizens' involvement, this is what it goes to. It goes to retirement, things like that. So we just have to consider if this is where we want people's money to go. So again, I put this up here because I know there's many people from many states. And again, people always ask, like, Beth, really, I've gotten in trouble with, I've been in trouble for a traffic offense. How much really can this cost? It's not a big deal. Well, it can cost a lot, is the bottom line. So what we have here is if you're driving on a suspended license, we see this a lot in Missouri. We drive in Missouri. It's expensive to get insurance and to keep that up. So we see this a lot. So your fine is $150 to $500, but then you can have incarceration costs. If you're locked up for any of these warrants, we can charge you up to $39 a night, even if you've not been convicted. Surcharges, added charges. So this would be about $206 to $582, and it would take about 5 to 12 months. Again, we've highlighted Missouri, but our numbers are much lower than some states. If you look at places like California, that's going to be $1,300 to $4,000 for that same offense. And if you look at places like Washington, other places like that. So this is important to know as well. There's not like a going rate for these costs. They're pretty substantial and they vary. But I also want to highlight that for many, many people, paying a small bill like this is just out of their reach. So we also know, and I know that you've talked about this in many of your presentations already, we do know that there's routine, racialized, and very costly police contact, right? So we found in our research with stakeholders as well as people in the community, people routinely denoted that they had half a dozen infractions. As I showed you that map up before, people have to drive through 10 different communities on their way to work. I drive through about that many on my way to work. And so if you don't have a license, or people can't see your temps, or maybe you have a tail light out, you will be stopped in each of those places, or you can be. What we also know about is that reforms did not change or waive existing warrants. So again, when we make this legal change, like Illinois with marijuana, right, we need to make sure that we get rid of some of these existing warrants if we really want to make an impact. Otherwise, this just hangs over people's heads. And as I mentioned, a lot of these interactions are for small infractions. And, many of these things, they're legal stops because people have probable cause, things like lack of a seatbelt, you can't see a license, false identification, things like that, but they are small. And so, as I mentioned before, most of this comes back to money and funding local governments. And so we still see that there's many different ways that communities can fund themselves. One way is through safety zones. There's a state statute that says if you can prove that you've had more than average in terms of crashes in that region or other incidents, then you can double or triple those fines. It's completely legal and very easy to do. We also saw over the last about 10 years, a lot of municipalities have developed an ordinance for seatbelt violations. If the officer looks in your car and isn't sure if you or the passenger have a seatbelt on, they just have to be not sure, then they can pull you over. Again, this $10 fine was touted as a safety measure. It's just $10. But again, this has allowed people to increase those traffic stops in many communities. So again, many of these laws are neutral in their design, but reinforce inequality in their application. And we know that unpaid legal financial obligations trigger many other things, which I'll talk about next. As I said, there's lots of challenges with compliance. It's very often multi-layered, time-delimited, and required frequent trips to court. Again, if you've had to go to court, you know just kind of the hassle of getting there. And we don't even talking about COVID today, which we can talk about in Q&A. That adds another layer. So many scholars have argued that this is a two-tier system of justice. If many of you got a ticket today, you maybe don't even need to go to court, right? You could just pay online, pay the surcharge, and be done with it. And that's for a lot of people. But we can continue to make laws based on this like fictional citizen that has money. Often the legislators have money, they can pay for it, we make it very easy. But for those who can't, then we have frequent court hearings, potential warrants, like I said, for failure to appear, and lost work and wages. We also have extended punishment. One thing that we do in Missouri, and there's allows for it in 17 states, is pay only probation. If you can't pay for your fine and fee, they can put you on probation, and it's basically like a layaway or a payment plan. But what comes with this payment plan, sometimes it's up to the judge, is they can charge you to be on probation. They can also put you on electronic monitoring, things like that. So if I was able to pay, I would just leave the courtroom. But again, we have this extended tethering and surveillance for people who cannot pay. And private companies who do most of this supervision can make violation reports and have very little oversight. In fact, in Missouri, this is very blatant in terms of how it's funded. The state statute in Missouri specifically says that private probation is completely offender funded. That is their words. We also know in felony probation, if you cannot pay, you can't earn earned compliance credit, which means that you can't get off probation earlier. You can actually extend people's probation for 1 year by state statute if you do not pay. And then if you're on felony probation in Missouri and you can't pay, then you can't vote either. So that was a really big comment made by people we talked to because it was the last election. So why didn't we change this? Why do we keep on having these problems? I've given some of it away, but let me talk about a couple of issues. One is the lack of legal representation. So individuals in Missouri who enter the municipal courts are not eligible for a public defender. You can't get one unless you're facing jail time. So only for like your third or fourth DUI, things like that can you get a public defender. So people don't have a mechanism to go through these court systems to figure them out. They don't have an advocate because obviously attorneys are very expensive. So this leads to an increased risks of driver suspension because, again, people don't know how to work the system. So this is the fundamental challenge with misdemeanor justice, again, is that clients are offered less protections because we're just like, they're small. Like, they don't need protections. This is a small impact. But what I'm saying is that it's multiplicative impact. So there's also few opportunities for resolving debts. We watched 200 hours of court. Like I said, interviewed almost 100 people. There's really no guidance. SB 5 says that you have to allow people to have an indigence hearing, but the people in court don't know that, and the judges don't offer it, right? So there's no systematic way to know how much someone makes and to know if they can pay. So again, we saw that fines were very, very often waived. And again, the state reform only required that community service be offered here. But we won't go into community service today, but that adds on a whole layer of challenges. So again, small fines can lead to large obligations. Finally, there's lack of systemic data on court requirements and compliance. So again, people go through 6 municipalities on their way to work. They're not sure how much they owe. In Missouri, we still have a very much a paper-based system. There is in SB 5 language that says that there has to be a state data system for the municipal courts, but that has not been implemented yet. And unique to the municipal courts now, for that system is a $7 fee. So again, when we talk about putting the fees of the criminal justice system on the citizens, this is about the best example I have. So one thing that I see in my jail work is that we see people often, or sometimes at least, get a failure to appear because they've been incarcerated the day of court. There's no systematic way to figure out if I'm in the county and someone's incarcerated 10 miles away in the city. There just isn't. So people just give them a failure to appear. And so they get out of jail and then they have a warrant. So we just don't have any way to share data. So I'll just kind of wrap this up with some conclusions so we can get to questions. But again, there has been a decline in police activities. This is something that we want to keep an eye on. But again, a large number of people still come into the court. And as I mentioned, there's this statutory inequality in that these laws are developed for these fictional citizens that have the ability to pay, and we don't consider the citizens who simply do not. So individuals remain tethered to the system. So justice is local, absolutely, but I would argue that the state structures have allowed these injustices to continue. There really hasn't been any oversight of the municipal courts. We see oversights of police departments, we see oversights of federal courts, things like that. But again, we ignore the municipal courts because those are just small crimes. I also argue that the court reforms are largely symbolic in nature and they did nothing to change the courts and the nature of the court system. What I have found in my research is that most municipalities did not earn more than 20% of their local funding before this SB 5. There was very few that were gaining all of their money from these laws. So by moving it to 20%, we really didn't change the amount. And this SB 5 only limits the amount that you can take home or that you can collect as a municipality. So I wanted to get some policy suggestions here really quick. So I am going to talk about, we should reduce or eliminate jurisdictional reliance on funding for monetary sanctions. It could be consolidation of municipal courts, but we really need to understand if we want a court and if we think these are important to enforce, are we going to fund that? We also want to eliminate the suspension of driver's licenses for unpaid costs and court noncompliance. And as I have here, Arnold Ventures have put a lot of money into some of this work, and 13 states have gotten rid of these laws. So there's a lot of movement here for debt-based driver's license suspension. A simple suggestion is we need to see how much people can pay. We need to assess if they can pay and allow some fee waivers. Right here in Illinois, they just passed some laws that allow waivers if you're up to 400% of the poverty line. So there's great reform coming here in Illinois. And then we need to have people get more information about their court dates. We can talk about text reminders, there's lots of examples here, but we also need to make sure that the data is secured from improper use. So that's always the challenge. We want more data, but we want to be careful about websites like mugshots.com and things like that so we can protect people. So thank you for letting me go so quickly. My research team is just phenomenal. I don't do any of this myself. I have lots of reports that do talk about all of these things, and I'm happy to take questions next.
Okay, so keep your hands up. I got Craig, Kaylee, Kelsey, Philip, Virginia. Okay, so start with Craig.
Hi, Craig McCarthy with the New York Post. So any of the reforms you were talking about that maybe you're pushing for and stuff like that, that you negotiated with that. So in New Jersey, where I used to report, there was 565 municipalities,
right.
And we had over 500 police departments. And
right.
the problem that I always came across, and I don't really cover this in New York as much now, is the data was impossible to obtain. So we could we could have oversight as the fourth estate, but we can't do anything unless there's actually reforms to be able to track this data. Because I think I did get data from them one time, and it came in a text file that was, how many lines that it was completely unreadable. So, and I think that's what I was asking, is have there any progress on reforms to at least have data collection on different states?
Yeah, there's a lot of people doing work out here for data, like Measures for Justice, other advocacy groups like that. But I think there's a lot more room to grow. I mean, I think Missouri is a perfect example. We don't even collect race on the people who have their driver's license suspended, and we actually need to put that into statute. I'm part of the Criminal Justice Committee for the state of Missouri, and that's one thing that we're working on. I mean, I think there's just this really fear of data. What will we know if what will we find out if we don't collect, or if we don't collect it, and things like that. But I think, there's a lot of funding streams, there's a lot of push here now for these data. And I think that's where journalism can come in, is to really push for some of these data and to show that it isn't out there at all. So I do like the work done by some advocacy organizations, but this is we're decades behind in terms of open data here. So it's even hard to know if we're making any progress. I always tell people it can tell us good things too. Data's your friend, right?
Okay. My question is really similar, but in the meantime, while we're pushing for and trying to get some systemized data there, and we're trying to report on problems and patterns in our own areas and across municipalities, are there places that we can go for data? Are there other points you would suggest that we can get that data so that we can start analyzing these municipal problems?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, what we've just done is gone to the budgets. So most budgets have to be on the web. And so we found, digging through a lot of those budgets is the way that is the only place that we can find it. But absolutely, there's just a huge pushback. And I want to also highlight the challenge that there's a lot of data partners out there, or organizations that all they do is develop these criminal justice data systems. I think we need to call them to the table as well, because I go to courts and I'm like, can I have your data? I worked with many rural municipalities. They're like, sure, Beth, you can have our data. They literally don't know how to get that data out. So there's a lot of these big criminal justice data systems that are not, developing their systems so they can get it out, so people can do this policy analysis. I think that's one of the biggest issues here that we don't talk about.
Hi.
No, it's your turn, right?
Virginia.
Hi.
Hi.
Virginia with the Statesman Journal in Salem, Oregon. Just a quick question. I think you mostly answered it, but
Sure.
How in-depth has the coverage been of these issues and any reforms in either local media or national media?
That's a good question. I think there was a lot of coverage of this after the killing of Michael Brown, and then it kind of quieted. I mean, that's why Arnold Ventures funded us, to be honest, is because they wanted to get a picture of what was going on. There is the Fines and Fees Justice Center that does a lot of this work out of New York City, and they have continued a lot of this work, but that has been kind of our goal, is to provide a landscape so people know just how big of a problem this is, in all of the states that we denoted.
Okay, Philip Jackson, HuffPost. I thought the data that you had on bench warrants specifically was interesting, and I wanted to know either within those numbers or maybe any other type of research that you had, how much of those bench warrants might have pertained to people not appearing in court for failure to testify in shooting cases, anything like that?
Failure to testify in shooting cases, that's a good question. I don't have that in any of the reports that I have, unfortunately, but I think I might be able to get that in St. Louis. We'll have to see. I'd have to look into it. But I do, I don't, so I can't tell you how big of a problem it is, but I think it goes to this larger issue. But we do know from a lot of our interviews that, people are very afraid of court. What happened during Ferguson or before Ferguson is that people would come to court and they would be arrested and taken to jail. So there's a lot of fear of that. But Yeah, I'd have to look more into that, but I know that St. Louis City is always working on ways, there's always concerns about people coming in to testify as well.
We have time for more questions. If anybody else has a question, raise your hands, but I have a question for you. You mentioned that 13 states have gone to changing the driver's license policies.
Yeah.
In other states, has there been a debate on it, or they just haven't gotten around to it? Or is there pushback to doing that?
Yeah, there's definitely pushback to doing it, and I know there's a lot of debate. I think this is why this sort of work is important. Again, people don't really think about that, you know, that people don't have the means to pay, that they're not just, you know, refusing to pay, but they actually don't have the means to pay. And so I think that's why this work is really important. And I think often states are looking to other states to see what they're doing. Is it a model? You know, now we have enough states doing it that we can find that, you know, some of the traffic data isn't worse. We don't have people in, you know, in more accidents. So there's been some really good research that shows, you know, if you allow people to have their driver's license and have them pay different ways, you know, the roads can still be safe. And so that's a lot of the concern with driver's licenses. So there are a couple studies that have considered that. And so I think that's a big momentum as well. And some things it's just getting in front of legislators to even think about, right?
Hi, Rio. I'm reporting in Las Vegas. I'm curious, I'm sorry if you answer this too. In St. Louis, those fees that they're collecting for suspended licenses, unpaid fees, stuff like that, do you know where that money is going, like what they're using that money for? And
Yeah, and we can sort of follow that money. So a lot of those are earmarked for some different things, and I kind of went by it quickly, but I do have a graph, like some of it's the retirement fee, some of it's the brain injury fund or the victim fund. So there's all these little pots of money, but then the rest, some of it will also go to the general revenue fund. And so that's what we're trying to unpack now, is to look at where does the money go, how is it used. Interestingly, this is where a lot of the legislation, or excuse me, a lot of the lawsuits is coming in. So like in Missouri, we charge money for a brain injury fund. And so people are arguing that you can't charge someone for a brain injury fund when their accident didn't have anything to do with brain injury. So we see a lot of legal organizations working on getting those unconstitutional.